way to Indiana, Pennsylvania, and we're going to check out the Jimmy Stewart Museum. What do you say?
Oh, I think that's a great idea.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Real History. I am your host, Jared Frederick, and here we have yet another special edition of our show. And what we would like to do is to take you on a mini field trip of the Jimmy Stewart Museum in Indiana, Pennsylvania. What we'll be doing is we'll be showing you the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. We'll be introducing you to some of the exhibits and artifacts, and of course, from that, we encourage you to come and visit and support this place yourself, if at all possible. So let's go ahead and take a stroll through the Jimmy Stewart Museum. We are filming this, as a matter of fact, on the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. And since we are a history channel as well as a cinema channel, it'd be good to talk about this guy right here. And this is Jimmy Stewart's grandfather on his mother's side. And his name was Samuel McCartney Jackson. And both of Jimmy Stewart's grandfathers actually served in the Civil War. This one served in the 11th Pennsylvania Reserves. And it just so happened that he fought at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. And so Jimmy Stewart, from the outset of his life, there was this notion of national service that was imparted to him. His grandfathers fought in the Civil War. His father served during World War I. And of course, as we will see at our next stop, Jimmy Stewart himself picked up that mantle of service. Jimmy Stewart was drafted into the peacetime military just a few months before the United States entered the Second World War. And he ended up joining the U.S. Army Air Forces. And in that capacity, he rose to the rank of full bird colonel. And he flew over 20 missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. And so this was a guy who really did his part. He didn't use his celebrity to try to dodge service or anything along those lines. And something that's very revealing and compelling about him is the fact that he remained in the Air Force Reserve following World War II and served throughout the Cold War and even participated in a bomber mission over Vietnam. And behind me, we can see one of Jimmy Stewart's flight suits from the Cold War era. And so in his mind, aviation and military service, it was something that was just as important to him as was his Hollywood and acting career. Jimmy Stewart was a longtime fan of aviation, and one of his really memorable moments as a child is when Charles Lindbergh embarked upon his transatlantic air journey in 1927. And this room chronicles and memorializes Jimmy Stewart's early fascination with aviation. As the flight was in progress, he was putting pins in a map, charting the journey as little bits of information were coming across the radio. And then, of course, about 30 years later, Jimmy Stewart ends up playing Charles Lindbergh in a film adaptation of that aviator's memoir. And perhaps at a later time, we'll examine that movie too on Real History. Here in the various galleries of the Jimmy Stewart Museum, there is a poster and a description of each of the 80-plus movies and various productions that he was involved in. And from a historical perspective, one that is really important and quite revealing is The Mortal Storm, which was released in 1940. And this is notable because it was one of the first cinematic depictions of the Holocaust. And this was something that, up until that moment, had by and large completely been off the radar of American movie-going audiences. And so this becomes a very important piece of historical commentary as the world was on the brink of the Second World War. two other really interesting Jimmy Stewart films that have some historical connotations to them, one of which is called Carbine Williams. And in that movie, Jimmy Stewart plays a convict by the name of Marsh Williams, who was actually the inventor and the designer of the M1 carbine. And for all of our followers who are fans of Second World War movies, this will become an instrumental weapon of war from the 1940s and well on to subsequent conflicts of the 20th century. And you know, we often think of Jimmy Stewart as this aw shucks, boy next door sort of charming fellow. But movies like this showed that he had the capacity for playing characters of a darker complexity as well. Now, in another film where he takes a more heroic turn is The FBI Story, which comes out in 1959. And this was a project in which Jimmy Stewart's fictional character is a vehicle for showing the history of the FBI from its earliest beginnings and up to the Cold War in the 1950s. This was a project that then director J. Edgar Hoover very much had a hand in, and one might even call it some really interesting and insightful 1950s Cold War propaganda. And so it's a very interesting relic of that very uncertain time in history. One of my favorite Jimmy Stewart movies is the 1954 biographical drama entitled The Glenn Miller Story. And once again, for those followers of ours who are familiar with the 1940s, Glenn Miller is somebody who hardly needs any introduction. And his co-star, June Allison, who starred in 3 movies with him throughout the 1950s, I actually met her here in this very museum when I was about 8 years old. And of course, here in the museum, there is a multitude of props, wardrobe, costumes, things of that manner. And here in this case beside me that was part of the Jean London Cinema Collection is the Class A dress uniform that Jimmy Stewart wore in The Glenn Miller Story as he was playing that iconic band leader of the 1940s. A really phenomenal Jimmy Stewart movie from the 1960s was really one of his last big leading man hits, and that was the 1965 film Shenandoah, in which Jimmy Stewart plays a Virginia farmer who wants to keep his family out of that conflict. And it was released in 1965, it was the centennial of the Civil War, but in many ways it's also an anti-war film that foreshadows a lot of the temperaments and mentalities of America in the divided era of the 1960s. And so, like so many historical films, this film tells us not only about the 1860s, but it also tells us about the 1960s as well. And it's a top-notch performance by Jimmy Stewart in this one. In the 1950s and 1960s especially, Jimmy Stewart starred in some of the best westerns that were ever made. And in this case behind me here, we can see some elements of his costumes that he wore repetitively in some of those films. Among the items that we see in this case are some elements of his costumes, his wardrobe, and his very distinctive cowboy hat. And you can see the sweat stain that goes around the band of it, and you can spot this in a number of his westerns throughout that time. These are just a few of the really compelling artifacts and exhibits and images that one can find at the Jimmy Stewart Museum, and we hope that someday you have the opportunity to come visit this gem of a museum yourself. And don't forget to tell them that Real History sent you.